So I've given talks on climate change before, and with the bill coming up in June, I thought it'd be a good idea. Actually, Zug started this on pushing the whole thing on how is it going to affect Switzerland? How can we inform people so that they have an idea of what's going on? And so that's how this started. So this is really focused, there's a little bit global, but this is really focused about what's going on in Switzerland. So just a couple of generic things. The planet's warmer. Our rate of emissions is higher than nature can absorb. We're doing it. We will not destroy the planet. Another 1 million, 2 million years, there'll be a whole different ecosystem. It'll be fine. The problem's creating an ecosystem for 8 billion people. There's some discussion on are we at 1 tons or 2 tons, or we need to get to 0. That's probably impossible. So we need to get down into the 1 to 2 ton range that we can offset that. And people talk about planting trees. There's other options, but that's where we need to get to. When we do that, kind of decides what temperature the planet's going to be. And if we wait long enough and we decide we need to reduce we want the temperature to come down, we'll have to reduce the emissions. Not what we're emitting, but out of the atmosphere. And there are all kinds of wonderful solutions out there, but they don't actually fit for 8 billion people. And this is a lot like banking. We talk about compounding interest and how great that is. This is the opposite of that. So the more effort we do initially, the longer time we have before we have to get down to that, I'll say 1 or 2 tons and figure out how to offset them. My opinion is that the people in charge don't have the imagination necessary. And I say that when I hear politicians say, I can't imagine Zurich without cars. So globally, you have to kind of look here. And one of the things that's important is what are they using for a baseline? In this globally, we tend to use pre-industrial time, 1850, 1900. And if that's the 0, then we're up around 1.2 degrees C above that. Atmospheric concentration has been going up. They started measuring that around 1960. It's not linear. The rate of the concentration's increasing. This is just showing a graph on where you have GDP and the red is CO2. And this specifically, so when you look at graphs, you need to pay attention to, is this around just carbon dioxide, or is this around carbon dioxide equivalents where it adds in other greenhouse gases? This is just around carbon dioxide. You can see the red has the recessions in it. The rate goes down. Actually, you get more of a change in the emissions than you do in the GDP. So this was going up to about 37 billion tons per year. And then we had Corona, and they're about a year or so behind in their evaluation of where we are on anything. The estimate is that we dropped about 7% in 2020, which is great. And the GDP went down between 1 to 4%. We need that 7% to happen for the next 30 years to get us down to where we need to go. And it's much better to have a plan than to rely on a pandemic to get your emissions down. And the problem is we're really stuck around this global, it's gross domestic product globally, and it has to grow at 2%. And these are the industries you see, these are the things you read about of we're growing this amount. And it doesn't fit with all that we keep hearing about as far as we need to reduce emissions, we need to get smaller. This sort of behavior is what's called business as usual, and that'll get us to about 4 to 6 degrees C. This is from the 2020 emissions gap. And an emissions gap is simply what's the gap between where we are and between where we should be. And if we have a 50% reduction in emissions by 2019 to 2030, that's fine. That puts us down here. Again, this is an equivalent CO2 in gigatons. The Paris Agreement says we need to be below in the order of 1.5 degrees. And so these numbers basically say if we hit this target of 24 billion tons emissions per year, we have a 66% chance of peaking around here. By 2100, we will hopefully drop that down to 1.5 or below. And that's a 66% chance that we will limit it to that temperature. There's a 90% chance that we're going to go up to 2 degrees and we'll be just below 2 degrees. So we need a little honesty in what are the odds of getting there? 66% or 90%? We're in Switzerland, right? Switzerland's little tiny country. How bad can it be? Where are we? So this is the number of frost days, and I picked this out of Zurich. It's indicative to all of Switzerland, but obviously if you go down to the Ticino or go up to Graubünden, it's going to be different, but the trends are going to be the same. And so what you see is frost days, we're getting fewer and fewer, and what happens, that means that spring tends to come a little bit earlier, fall lasts a little bit longer, you get a longer period of warm time, which allows the insects to prosper even better. So your insect population goes up. And the other part of that is pine beetles go up. And when you have a nice long summer, spring and so, then they have 2 series of the pine beetles. And if you're out and you're walking, you see all these pine trees that are dead, that's where they're coming from. And one of the answers to that, they don't have an answer really, is they cut the trees down so that the pine beetles don't keep going to other trees. So the next part is snow days. And snow is a type of battery. All right. So you want as much snow as possible up in the mountains to build up the glaciers and the snowpacks that melts for a long period of time. You get water coming into the creeks, goes down to the rivers, and everything's fine. When you have less, by the time the end of the summer comes around and it's hot, you simply have less water in the rivers for the hydroelectric, and the aquifers aren't getting as much because the water ran off into the creeks. Ski industry is obvious. Since 1960, they've had 38 fewer, you can read, it's been having a problem. And so what they started doing in 90 was blowing additional snow. And I was just at a place where they just put up about 1,300 meters. They just put up a 4-person ski lift. And my question was, why? When you know, so the ski industry needs to really kind of rethink their business plan, and whether that's moving everything further up, I don't know. Number of heat days. So again, I didn't point out, we're here around 2020. This data is starting, 81 to 2010, and you just basically are following the trends. So you have more heat days. We had less snow that's up in the mountains. It's going to melt quicker. Which means in the summer, you have less water in the rivers. Nuclear reactors are going to need to actually power down a bit, and because they need the cooling water. And if they're running too much, depends on the reactor. If they're running too hot, they're not cooling down enough. And during those times, it's typically when you want more electricity because the shops are running the air conditioners more. And then you have the problem with, this was a big problem in, I think it was 18 or 19, where the train tracks were buckling, roads were buckling. And so you need to figure out how are we going to address that problem. And agriculture, so if I pick tomatoes, because I have them in the garden, but if you have a heat wave and it's 29 degrees or above for a week or two at the wrong time, your tomatoes won't go to flower. So you won't get any tomatoes at all. And that happens to lots of the crops. The tropical night, basically you increase the humidity in the atmosphere with the temperature. And you get the nighttime to where it simply doesn't cool off because the humidity is high enough, you have cloud cover, and doesn't really look like clouds, but the heat can't radiate to the sky and it just stays trapped. And so, like I said, with as the planet warms, then you have more moisture in the air. And so as your moisture increases, you get more precipitation in the winter and a little bit less precipitation in the summer. And that doesn't seem like it's really too bad. But the problem is, and this has to do with averages, you end up getting 1 to 2 days worth of, or the whole month worth of rain, and 1 to 2 days in 1 to 2 days. And so statistically, you have an average monthly precipitation. But what you ended up with in reality was a combination of floods and droughts. What temperature are we headed for globally? And this is not around policy, this is around how we're behaving. Where we were talking about what marketing is going through, and they're saying airlines are going to go up 40%, cars are going to go up 30%, and all those. That's business as usual, which leads us to between a 4 to 6 degrees C increase by 2100. So when you have flooding, right, you get, depending on the time of year, you're going to have either, whether it's avalanches or whether it's mudslides. So the question is, how do you evaluate those and go, this is a function of climate? They're getting worse because of climate change, right? Right. So we have 13 and they're all in the same. It has nothing to do with, in particular, finances, which is how the media tends to judge these things. We had this event that happened, hurricane, mudslide, avalanche, whatever it was, and it cost us much. And then we have another event that happened that costs this much. So obviously things are getting better or worse. And it doesn't say anything about what the cost of the buildings are, how many buildings or anything like that. So you really need parameters that are around the physical characteristics of that event. And what you get if you have too much rain, there's a couple of questions, I'll answer them in a couple of minutes. What you get if you have too much rain is you get mudslides, all right? If you have too little rain, then you have the problem we had on the Rhine a couple of years ago. And there's about 500,000 tons a day that move, product that moves on the Rhine. And in July to October in 2018, they lost 60% of its depth. And in some areas, it was even as low as 50 centimeters, and ships just couldn't go past that. And what they did is said, we need to keep going. So we're going to load the ships or the cargo carriers, half full. So you end up with twice as many on the river, and so you've made your emissions worse, which just makes the whole problem worse. So that's a really good example of a positive feedback loop. Switzerland actually didn't get any gasoline coming upstream at that period of time. And this was kind of the response. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but this response is in maintaining transportation to be stable. That's really focusing on the GDP. It's not taking a look at it and go, okay, we need to do something different. And I actually have somewhere a couple good examples of some different ways to adapt. So this is where Switzerland is as a whole. We looked at where areas were trending in the Zurich area. This is as a whole. What's important again is you look at the baseline. So if you're up here, so Switzerland's up into the 1.5 degree range, but our baseline is here. And the baseline that we talked about for the planet was back in the pre-industrial age. So if you add them together, Switzerland's in the order of 2 degrees higher than we were back in this range. And everybody talks about the planet being about 1.2 degrees higher. And that's normal. The further north that you get, the worse it is. And this is where we're headed. Again, they changed the time of the baseline. We're in the 1980 to 2010 range. This is about where we are now, which gives us about it doesn't really matter. We're at 1 degrees, some magical number. If we go business as usual, 40 years, we're going to be an additional 2 degrees more than we are now. If we really work like crazy, we may go up a little bit and then we may come down, back down. But that just gives you an idea of this business as usual graph that's kind of where we've been headed. This is what we're voting on. And there's kind of a lot in here, so just kind of bear with me. This is on the not CO2, but the CO2 equivalent, which combines in the methane, nitrous oxide, and then the synthetic gases are the ones that are used in air conditioners and coolants and different refrigerants. So we started at 1990. We dropped our 20% to 2020. That's great. We're basically by 2050, we're supposed to lose an additional 17.5% within Switzerland, 12.5% somewhere else. And those are agreements that have been signed, I think, with Peru, and I don't know the details of those. I don't know how much of those are offsetting our emissions and how much are helping them to reduce their emissions, but there's this split. So if you add up the 20 to here, the 17.5 and 12.5, we're at 50% by 2030. That's what we're looking at. And then the second part of the goal is by 2050, we want to drop another 70 to 85%, which gets us down into this. And if you do it as a per capita, we're in a little less than 1 to 2 tons per person. If we took Switzerland's approach and spread that across the whole planet, the temperature rise would be in the 2 to 3 degree rise. And Switzerland's not alone. I mean, there's actually some charts that show the majority of the country, or a large percentage of the countries, are in this 2 to 3 degree temperature rise. And then you have US and Australia, and we're going to push it up to 4. So, but one of the issues is, if you look right here, we import almost 2/3 of our lifestyle. And a lot of that, about 50% of the food that we eat, is imported. And obviously all the cars, computers, all that stuff is imported, and all that stuff has emissions tied to it. So whether those will become more difficult to purchase, more expensive, I have no idea. But what we think of as our lifestyle it's much more than that. Okay, questions. Do we know the environmental impact of making snow and ski resorts? I don't know the environmental impact. My question is, where does the power come? I mean, the power comes out of the grid, and where does the water come from? If the water's coming from an aquifer, is it coming from a local lake? I have no idea. But those are the kind of the questions that I think are important, but I don't. Do we know? I do not. Back to here. So Switzerland emits a really small percent, right? 0.1% of the global emissions. And if it's so small, why bother worrying about it, right? If we do nothing, we're not going to have much of an effect. If we do a whole lot, we're not going to have much of an effect. So the question is, why bother? And I would go with an ethics. You know, if a bunch of countries that are similar say, why bother? Then we're actually going to be dependent upon what the rest of the world is doing, and the emissions will go up. That's the business as usual part. I really like, and this is me, I really like the concept of leading by example. And whether you're showing other industrialized countries that, yes, you can do this, and here's how you do it. And personally, I think that would open up a whole bunch of new businesses on consulting on to go show other countries, this is how you do this. In developing countries, they're leapfrogging technology. They didn't put in telegraph lines to a lot of the rural areas. They're going right to cell phones. So if we show what you can do and basically say, you know, we did this for 75 years, there's a better approach, and here's what we're doing, you get a cascading effect, and you get a lot more impact that way. Selfish reason is I like to eat, so I have a garden. And we do this, right? China does this, reducing damages. I mean, not China, sorry. Switzerland, you can go up to a lot of the areas that had problems with avalanches, and they have avalanche fences up there. So they got tired of rebuilding the town. Or they have right in the middle or near the town, there's a huge ditch that's lined with stones because they know they're going to have floodwaters, whether that's from melting snow or mudslides or whatever it is. So we already have installed some of these technologies to go, what could happen? Let's We know what's going to happen. We're not going to stop the snow. We're not going to stop the mudslides. So how can we adapt so they don't have to wipe out our town all the time? And that's part of this. That's part of this real trick is how do we reduce our emissions and energy consumption? How do we change in a way that adapts us to the future? Because there's a whole lot of ideas that say, let's do this to reduce emissions. And that's great, but you haven't done a thing to really help you 50 years down the line. And now 50 years down the line, you're going, And so you'll actually have more emissions by doing that. If we can think ahead a little bit, we can really reduce that and have a much bigger impact. As far as leading, China is actually leading the world on renewables and things like that. Just as a point of information, about 2 years ago, there were 425,000 electric, the big ones, big electric buses in the world, and China had 420,000 of them. So why don't we have all of our buses in Switzerland being electric? Are we going to prepare or are we going to react to our future? We have this choice. This slide is a little bit unfair. This is not, the corn and soybeans are not what people would eat. They are used for animals and biofuels. But the question then becomes, and we hear, well, we're going to grow fuel to do this. And my question is, so what are you going to do the following year when you had a bad crop with 50% yield and you go, we're only going to drive half as much, or we're only going to fly half as much. And it's not only using a lot of land, but you're at the whim of nature much more. And we're saying two things out of our mouth. One is we're saying that nature's going to cause a problem with agriculture. It's going to reduce yields, but we're going to grow food food product in order to, as a fuel. But it will have the same impact on that. And when you look at the agricultural yields in, say, Europe in the 2018, 19, and 2020 timeframe, most of the articles talk about, yeah, but we can go out to the world market to get food. But if the world market looks like the US here, you're not going to be able to do that. Questions? We have another one here. Do you know the biggest industries for the imported emissions? My guess is they are listed. There's actually an incredible amount of information out on the Swiss website for the government, for their energy website. And they have some Excel spreadsheets that go through a whole bunch of different where does the energy come from to do things? And I don't know on the imported if they talk about energy per product. I just don't know that. So how do we get out of this? Good question. And yes, it's not a great metaphor for a environmental group to talk about eating elephants, but it's a big problem. And you do it a bit at a time, but you keep working on it, right? And one of the things is you have to have a plan, which is the opposite of how we ended here. So we kind of just said, well, if we can build it, we can get marketers to get people to buy it, and let's just do this. And we have all this land where we can build homes on, and I know we can sell them because people are moving to Switzerland. And if you look at urban sprawl here, it's as bad as a problem as it is in lots of places in the US. I mean, so I would say, we haven't planned for the number of people we can handle in Switzerland, whatever that means. But we need to plan the whole aspect. So it's like any problem, you identify the problem. And at a global standpoint, 8 billion people are going to have a problem. And I used the word thrive, and I don't know if that's correct. I wanted to get past survive, but I don't know if 8 billion people will actually thrive in the changing environment. So what does it mean to us? Because again, this is around Switzerland. We're at 0.1%. We're not going to change the planet. And it really is then, how can we adapt? And they go back to a lot of the mountain villages chose not to adapt by rebuilding their homes all the time. They chose to adapt by putting up avalanche fences so that they didn't have to rebuild their homes. So to pick kind of a point, we have this precedent. We've done this in a number of things, and we just need to do it at a much, much bigger scale. Adapt, yes, to change in order to better fit into the new situation or place. And I don't know if you're familiar, if you do a search on COVID-15, you'll find out that the average, you got to go with average again, person gained 15 pounds by sitting in front of their screens all day. So that's 7 kilograms in Switzerland. And then I can adapt to that, right? I can say, okay, this is not good. I'm going to reduce what I eat or exercise or a combination, or I'm going to support the GDP and I'm going to buy bigger clothes. And the question then becomes, well, what happens if we're stuck here for another 6 months? Or that doesn't actually help, right? So you can do that. You can go buy the bigger clothes, you're comfortable, everything's fine, but it doesn't necessarily help your health or long-term other issues. So what's the root cause? So we're generating more than nature can absorb. You guys can, yep. So here's where the greenhouse gases are coming from where they are coming, right? And basically it's from burning, right? You burn gasoline, natural gas, we have cows, we burn in waste, whether it's industrial or residential, and then you burn heating oil. And that leads to energy consumption. 60% of the energy is burned. The energy plan has that we will reduce our electrical consumption by 13%, and the energy in general over here, non-electrical, by 43%. Timeline, we need zero emissions. We've talked about that. We have 2 ways we can get there. We can either go kind of a normal route, or we can work in a hurry and have a lot longer to get to that point. Because getting down past this 2 tons is going to be a real challenge. And this is one of the reasons why this, you know, from a tonnage standpoint, roughly half the people on the planet are living at less than a ton. Okay, so we have 37 billion tons. Half the people are emitting 10%. But the media publishes we have an average of 5. So what's the big deal? The big deal is 10% are creating 23 as a point of reference. That's about the value of the yearly income for the top 10%. This is again CO2, not CO2 equivalent. And the top 1% are doing the 75 to 80 tons. So alternative, we need big, bold, creative solutions. And one is, and we see this, we hear about it, we're going to replace cars. We need this much electricity. If we were to replace the existing internal combustion cars that we have, we need that much electricity. I picked solar panels simply as a method to replace it for the illustration. This is what we install. If we ramped up by a factor of 5 in 12 years, we would have enough that we would be able to power all the cars. But that would also mean by January 1st, 2022, we were not selling any more internal combustion cars. And then you kind of look at, well, the bigger problem is this: can you pick the electric cars out of here? And the answer is no. And if you look at that, you go, you know, we need a couple extra lanes. So those emissions are not counted into transitioning from the internal combustion car to a electric car, right? We have a transportation problem, not a car problem, because there's only one car headed north. So we really, really need to think a lot bigger and a lot crazier and realize that this is an energy problem. Yes, there's a financial issue, but it's really about energy. And we want to, there's couple projects I wanted to just show you. They wanted to slow the melting of the glaciers down, but they're going to require 30,000 tons of snow a day to slow this one down. They're going to cover this one with tarps in the summer, but they won't stop it. And so the question becomes, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to manage or control the melt rate so that you have it constantly over the summer? What's your goal? And I haven't read enough about these to know, but we need to look at the trade-off. And yes, this is a big financial trade-off, and perhaps it's worth it depending on your goal. But one of the goals that I read about was tourism. And my question would be, where are those tourists from? Where are those tourists coming? Another big idea, right? So greenhouses, they get bigger and bigger. And there are several countries here that have 100-hectare greenhouses. And I'm not saying that that's actually would work in Switzerland, but I'm not saying it's not. It's trying to give you an idea of we need to think much bigger than we have been and much more, I want to say dynamic or aggressive in some of these things. Switzerland has about 1 million hectares tied up in agriculture. And China has about 1 million hectares under greenhouses. It's a bigger country. I'm not saying that, but think bigger, okay? This is a little bit bigger. This is cool. They started off, so they're floating solar panels on a lake. The lake at the end of the year usually ends up drained. This is only 2% of the lake that they covered, but they're still continuing to cover it, and they're going to end up covering about 55% of it. And a common answer on whether solar panels on something like this or wind turbines up in the mountains, those are ugly. I don't want to see those when I'm out, da-da-da-da. But that valley would be really pretty if we got rid of all the buildings and got rid of the gondola. So we have this, and we're going to have to make decisions. And if you plan, you're going to go, okay, these lakes, you're going to pick certain lakes. These lakes are going to have solar panels on them. Here's where the wind turbines are going. And they can't go all across Switzerland because we don't have enough good wind in Switzerland. It's only in certain areas. But if you plan that and do that, then you have lots of areas that are still out in the woods and everybody's happy. So then you pick, okay, we have these alternative solutions, pick one, implement it, good big solutions, and evaluate it. And we do these sort of things. I know this sounds, Jack, we know how to solve problems and we do it all the time. But when we get to big projects, it's either we don't do it or we implement the plan and we don't change. And you have to evaluate that regularly. And it might be 2 years until you get enough feedback, but you do this and you modify the plan and you move on. Something happened. And this is part of that part I was talking about as far as a trick to do, right? Buildings are a big consumer. There's an actual process when you're addressing a building and the energy consumption. First thing you do is insulate it. Second thing you do is address the heating system. If I put in a heat pump first, it's going to have to be large, and that requires more electricity. And if I do that a lot, we're going to go, we don't have enough electricity in Switzerland. We haven't kept up with the installation of new solar panels or wind, and we're going to need to buy it from Germany, which is burning coal. If you insulate first, I need a much, much smaller heat pump. Now my electrical is much less. This conservation is a huge deal. Repurposing non-climate change buildings. I'm talking about buildings that will kind of disappear. So if we need to ground a bunch of airplanes, then what do you do with the rest of the airport? Transportation, it needs to change. In my view, even the mass transit needs to change. And there was a really good thing on the news, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, that somebody had an interesting, different perspective of what trains would look like. And they were much shorter so that you had much more flexibility at peak hours versus when you had far fewer people. And obviously we need to change the design for the temperature variations. Sorry, you can keep a few cows, we got to get rid of a bunch of them. This is a system issue. And so you're going to have to go through and say, what are our trade agreements are going to have to be modified to do that. If we get rid of 50% of the cows, you plant trees to offset the remaining, or whatever that number is. A lot of the studies have been done. It's just a matter of going through it. Reduce our total energy consumption. And that's in the energy plan. It was reducing it by 43%, that's great. And so if you insulate buildings, so we had one that was done not too far from where I live, and they put an extra, it already had about 8 centimeters. They put an extra 15 centimeters of insulation on it, which is great, but they didn't do anything to the roof. Probably, I'm assuming, they didn't want to rip off the roof, insulate that, it costs a lot. But if I put solar panels on the roof, I don't have that direct contact in the summertime with the sun, and I can get away without having it insulated as much. I lived in an energy apartment. I was on the top floor, and in the summertime, it was 27 grad in the apartment. Never turned the heat on in the winter, but in the summertime, it baked right down. And they had grass up there, but the grass was dead, so it didn't do anything. So using solar panels, not only to cool the roof, but you could use it potentially to cool, say, south-facing or west-facing walls. That's, engineers can go through and do those calculations. That's not difficult. And this, kind of the last slide here, and then I've got a couple questions to answer. So it's all tied together as a net, all of it, right? So we're in a household and I need to go buy food, and maybe I live in an area where it's too far. And so I need to drive to a grocery store, or maybe I'm going to drive to a neighbor farm to get a couple things, or drive to both. And how do I get to work? And if I say we get rid of 90% of the cars, I have all of these car sales places that are going to be empty. What do we do with those? And so this whole net is tied together. And if I pull on it, we're going to have a problem. And at this point in time, almost everybody in Switzerland can read. Almost everybody has access to the internet. You know climate change is a problem. You should be redoing your business models. There was a question on snow. Every snow place, every ski resort should be redoing their business model on what do we do? How do we do this so that, you know what, our business is going to be actually only 20% in the winter and the rest is in the summer. I don't know what that means, but getting really creative on how to change things and pulling on this thread. And the biggest concern around, and I don't know how to present this in a graphical manner to make it look right, but the biggest concern is, I've been doing this for 20 years. How do I support my family when you just told me I can't do this anymore? And that's an absolutely valid response. And the answer is, we need a huge national retraining program. And Switzerland is less of an industrial country than the US, France, or Germany. So maybe we need less of retraining, but this is a big issue that in the US is just now starting to get addressed. From, we're going to not mine coal, we're going to build solar panels, we will retrain you so that you can have a job and support your family. Oh, by the way, you'll get paid more and you don't have to work inside the mines. So not only do the politicians need to know this, but the citizens need to understand this and support this. And that's pretty much where we are. And we're going to choose here. Are we going to wash glasses, or are we going to train on how to operate a lifeboat? And I've got a couple other questions here. Let me go down here. How do we encourage Switzerland companies to reduce emissions and use less energy without causing them to add cost to the already high cost of manufacturing? So very quickly, we waste what we don't value. My view is energy is way too cheap, because when you listen to what people talk about, it's like, we can do that, energy is not a problem, et cetera, et cetera. If energy were a problem, if it were priced right now, energy average in Switzerland is 23 Rappen per kilowatt hour. If we were to increase that to a franken or 2 franken per kilowatt hour, people would definitely do things differently. And industry, if they had to pay residential rates, which is what we pay, they would definitely do things differently. And you would see huge efficiency changes in what they're doing. Why am I manufacturing, I'm going to pick on a phone. Why am I manufacturing a phone that has and then creating an operating system which has a life of 3 years, when I could probably make one, and there's some on the market, they just don't have a lot of applications for them, but you can replace the battery, you can replace the motherboard, you can replace the, whatever it is, and that phone should last you for 10 years. So now your whole costs are down. You're spread out costs over that 10 years instead of having to buy 3 phones or wanting to buy 3 phones. I don't have an answer for you. And what I just gave as a partial answer causes all kinds of other problems, because I know, I've talked to people, but Jack, a lot of people can't afford to pay 3 times or twice, whatever you are advocating to pay for electricity. That's a system. And the other part I didn't talk about is every single problem we solve will create more problems, right? I'm hungry. I'm going to go get something to eat. I have dirty dishes. I had to go to the grocery to get the food. Every time we solve a problem, I get other problems. Hopefully, if we're intelligent, they're smaller, but they will cause problems and you have to address them. And don't go, well, we're not going to do that because then, you know, the poor people can't afford electricity. Okay, that's another problem. How do you solve that and push this to where people can, people take electricity seriously, or they value it. Making all cars and other vehicles electric just creates more electric pollution. Exactly. What makes it? Nothing makes it a good idea. That's kind of what I was trying to show, is when you have a traffic jam, they can all be electric. The only thing you gain by going to electric car is tailpipe emissions are reduced. But you know, people are talking about microplastics. Where does the tires go, right? Why do I have to replace tires? Every time a road is widened, more people will start driving. Oh, we can get to Italy now in 45 minutes. So let's go ahead and drive this time. It creates more problems. Speaking of cars, very quickly, it's an incredibly inefficient method of travel. Cars are designed for typically 5 people. Count them. I count cars on the road a lot. I know I'm weird, but 1 out of 10 cars has more than one person. 90% of the cars on the road have one person. Of the other 10%, 90% of those only have 2 people. So we have a whole transportation system that's operating at 22%. It's highly inefficient. Can't garbage be used to make energy? We burn it all the time. We burn it all the time. Actually, I couldn't find it for this presentation, but in an earlier presentation, they were talking, out on a website that I was looking at, it was talking about actually we're counting on garbage to be increased so that we can get more electricity. And this is nuts. You want to reduce the garbage, so I didn't use the electricity to make it in the first place. Conserve what you have. Have I seen Seaspiracy? I have not. Sorry, I haven't seen it. And I will be honest with you, I won't watch it. I haven't eaten fish in 15 years, at least. Anyway. How about incentivizing households and companies by decreasing their taxes or subsidizing in some other way, and they constantly reduce their quarterly energy consumptions? Sure, and that's one of those, you know, that's this part of, so if electricity is too high, then you take all those taxes and you would give some of that back to the people on the inverse of whatever they're paying in taxes, so that they can pay their electric bill. It's not that you're subsidizing the electricity, you're having them pay less tax. And I'm sure there's easier ways to do that than what I just said. But right, you know, there's another way that you could do this. We talk about we're going to charge, and they do this now. Heating oil right now is in the order of 92, 95 franken a ton CO2 emissions, something like that. And you could, if you had a limit, so I have, let's say Jack has, next year, you have 5 tons of CO2 that you have, and here's the value of it. And I only spend 3 tons, I can sell that on the open market to someone that wants to go more. And if you bring that down every year, so the next year I only get 4 tons, and the next year 3 tons, you've reduced the amount of emissions people can have. But the people who are being really conscious, I can sell that ticket, that rationing ticket. And they did this in World War II. You had rationing tickets for food and gasoline and tires and things. And people that didn't need it for one reason or another, they sold them to others, and that was a supplement of their income. So there's all kinds of other approaches to this.
Jack, actually, we still have a few closing remarks. So thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you so much, Jack, for being able to answer all of them, actually. Again, thank you, Jack, for your presentation. It was so nice to have you again as a speaker. for those who didn't know, Jack is actually an international volunteer for WWF Zurich, and he's been with us for many, many years. He even actually had a presentation about understanding carbon footprint a year ago. And in a week, he'll again have a presentation about carbon footprint, which would be very, very interesting. Before we proceed, I would like to thank David, who is the one who's answering your chat questions. He also provided the Zoom links, and also the rest of the other teams, such as the social media team, who helped us with posting and getting you to find our event. It would be great if you could please answer our survey form. This will help us know how we can have better events for you and how that we can get more attendees to be involved with us, and also to be more aware of our events. If you could open this before you go and answer it, that would be very, very much appreciated. Thank you. Next is that we actually have our social media. David sent the links already, but we will send them again. So please follow us. It's the best way to be updated on our upcoming events. We also have other campaigns such as Meatless Mondays on our social media in Facebook and Instagram, and Altag Freitag, and many more. So I highly suggest that you please check our social media so that you would receive the latest updates, and also other things that we want to share. Like there's lots of tips and tricks on how to live sustainably. So we actually have another event coming up. Like I said, we have Jack's second part of his climate change talk, which will be carbon footprint calculator. So this will be on Thursday, on April 6th at 7 p.m. We already actually have a meetup page set up. So please, if you're interested and you would like to know like how you can do yourself to actually reduce CO2 emissions, what you can do as an individual, or even there are also ways on how you can do it as a group or part of your company, please register, and we look forward to hearing more from Jack on what we can do to reduce our CO2 emissions, as well as actually how to use a carbon footprint calculator that WWF has. On May, we have a cleanup. It will be most likely in Zurich, Zug, and Basel. We will send out an update closer to the event, and you will find out more information about this event in our meetup page and also via our social media website, social media accounts. So please follow them. That's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Jack.
Thank you.